I'd like to introduce our speaker today. David Quinto-Pozos is an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics. He received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Texas at Austin. He worked as an interpreter for almost 10 years before teaching. He has served several times in the board of Mano a Mano, a national organization of sign language interpreters who work in Spanish-speaking communities, and has been involved in efforts concerning the need for multilingual interpreter certifications. He has published numerous times on sign language pragmatics and linguistics, and through the publication presentations such as Interpreting for Foreign Language Courses, The Case of Spanish, and Enactment as a Communicative Strategy, a composition between English co-speech gesture and ASL. Dr. Quinto-Pozos has also discussed comparison of verbal and signed languages. And welcome, and we will start. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. Some of what we're going to talk about may be old material for you, or some of things that you already know, but we'll also, just by way of background, talk a little bit about ASL, and beyond that, then we'll get into the specific topic, which is a really interesting one, I think, that has to do with how ASL instruction is usually conducted. Even though there's not a writing system that's generally used for the language. As I mentioned, I'm going to do a little bit of background information. Try not to spend much time on that, just so that I can situate this topic within the much larger discussion of ASL instruction, and also the community of instructors here in this country. So ASL, we'll talk a little bit about instruction over the last few decades, but then we'll really dive into the strategies that are used, not just in our program, but also beyond our program, from a kind of curricular point of view, for doing a few different things: assessing students, providing material for literary study. These broad topics that often involve writing. How are they handled in ASL? Essentially, is what we'll do. And then I'll get into a brief discussion about what it is that we're trying to do in ASL. And I think what lots of language instruction is trying to do is develop this socio-pragmatic competence. And then beyond that, what might we be able to glean from this for the instruction in spoken language, and what that might mean for the picture much larger than ASL. So, if you didn't know, ASL has been around for about 200 years. It's related to French Sign Language, and it's actually, we call it Old French Sign Language simply because it was French Sign Language 200 years ago. But it's grammatically distinct from the spoken languages, the ambient spoken languages. So LSF, or French Sign Language, is different from French Sign Language grammar, just as ASL is different from English grammar. And it's different in a number of different ways. I just put a few up here, just as examples. The tense and aspect systems are quite different. ASL and other sign languages tend not to have copula constructions, and there are articles and determiners that are quite different across the languages. ASL has been studied for about the last 40, 50 years, in earnest since about the 70s. And one of the things that I just want to point out, because I think it's important for this piece about not having a writing system, is that there are a lot of qualities that ASL and other sign languages have that focus on what I tend to call, or what others have tended to call, simultaneous structure, so that you can use multiple articulators at the same time, not just your hands, so not just manual production, but what's going on with the face and facial features and the body, the torso. And all of that together kind of creates the meaningful message. So what that means is that there's a lot of structure that's inherently simultaneous, kind of layered, sort of like tones in spoken language are layered with the lexical items. That's the way ASL is in some ways. The deaf community itself, at least in this country, has its roots in education, and ASL really was born at a school for the deaf. In the early 1800s, a school was established in Connecticut, and within a few short decades, there were the beginnings of ASL as we know it. terms of the number of users of ASL, it's really kind of anyone's guess, although there have been estimates in the literature anywhere from about the lower bounds at a couple 100,000 to a couple million. So it really is this kind of large range, and there was a 2006 article that I cite here that it talks about this very issue about not having a really reliable estimate of the number of users. Likewise, we don't really have a very reliable estimate of where it ranks in the most frequently or in order of the most frequency of use in the United States. So if you consider English first and perhaps Spanish second or whatever that may be, where does ASL rank there? And I don't think we have reliable estimates for that, although people have said third or fourth or second. So it's somewhere in there. Many of our ASL instructors are themselves members of the community, meaning they're deaf or part of the users of ASL. That number, that 500,000 or so. And I think another really important point, although I'm not going to get into it and I'm happy to talk about it later if we have questions about it, is just how the deaf community is very invested, I think, in the teaching of American Sign Language. Because of a history, a pretty rich and complex history of relationships between hearing and deaf people in this country, and really beyond this country as well. And so I think that for lots of deaf people, they feel that we'd love to see ASL continue to be taught and learned, and be really one of the important languages. And this not even just this country, but I should also mention that ASL is used in Canada as well, or parts of Canada. Anglophone Canada, anyway. As I mentioned, ASL instruction began in earnest in the 70s and 80s, really which was about the time that there was a lot of ASL research going on as well. In the mid-70s, there was an organization established called the ASLTA, or American Sign Language Teachers Association. The ASLTA has been pretty instrumental in the various matters regarding ASL instruction over the years. The most recent work that the ASLTA has done is they've drafted a version of the actual standards for ASL, because there's not a writing component or a reading component. There's a draft that's circulating now, and I think probably will be published at some point soon. But there's a lot of work that the ASLTA has done over the years in terms of policy matters, but also just kind of as a professional organization for instructors of ASL. So at some point in the, 80s or so, ASL started to be recognized as a, maybe even as early as the 70s, as a legitimate language, and as a language that could potentially fulfill a foreign language requirement. So its interest, its popularity as a language really blossomed, exponentially. And enrollments have increased dramatically since the 90s. This is just an example from the 2010 MLA report. So ASL is now listed fourth under the most commonly taught language here in the US. 2009 figures have it at nearly 92,000 students, which is, I think, the fall of that year, ranking just behind Spanish, French, and German. And if you're curious, here in Texas, the most recent figures I could find, and even I looked on the TEA website, and if anyone knows how to access figures for ASL on the TEA website, let me know, because I'd love to know. I looked at, this is just out of a publication from 2008. It looks like in 2005 there were at least 15,000 here in Texas. What's interesting is that if you look at the other states with the other high enrollments, it would be like California perhaps at 11, Florida at 12. So we're above all of the states listed here in terms of enrollment for ASL. So let's get into the meat, really the meat of the talk. I gave you just a little bit of background so you could have a sense of where ASL has been for the last few decades. There are really a number of curricula that are used in ASL instruction. A pretty popular one is called VISTA, or Signing Naturally. VISTA is the community college that it was developed at in California. This one follows a pretty general CLT approach, communicative language teaching, They use the terms functional notional approach, from the old functional notional syllabus. But it's that emphasis on communication, the function of communication, and less of a focus on grammar instruction or making sure you conjugate your verbs correctly. Bravo ASL is another one that is like Sounding Naturally. And there are a few others on the market that are used in ASL programs. I listed a couple others here simply because most ASL programs have at least a few of these books on their shelves, and they'll pull from them from time to time for different lessons. That still happens. But a pretty popular one, I think that Sounding Naturally would be probably the most commonly used curriculum right now for ASL instruction. What I'd like to talk about specifically today is how we, here at UT, but even beyond UT, how we, with ASL instruction, administer and evaluate assessments, because assessments are normally done in spoken language instruction via writing. Not always, but often. How we assign and how we evaluate homework, and also the idea of building literary knowledge and skills for ASL users. And what does that mean, to have literary skills in ASL? What really does that mean? A common theme that you're going to see me discuss over the course of all three of these points is the use of videos. Videos have become a very important technological tool for ASL instruction over the years, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we do it. So, to begin with assessments, if we talk about assessments in ASL instruction, first from the comprehension point of view. At least here at the UT program, in say 506 and 507, we have nearly weekly assessments in ASL, not all of which involve production components, but all of which do involve comprehension components. They're easier to do simply because you don't have to videotape the students. The students don't have to videotape themselves. And so in these cases, the instructors assign test phrases or test items, and then the students respond on a sheet. And so what they're responding in is sometimes in English, but sometimes they're also responding just by drawing something or indicating if it's a description of an actual spatial feature. They may draw on a map what that spatial feature may look like, or where it's directed, or whatever the question may be about. There are also questions where the students respond in multiple choice format, or true false, or even in short answer. But again, those involve the use of English. We haven't quite reached the point where, for a comprehension part of the exam, then the student immediately responds, in just sign, but rather it's still the use of writing to some extent, and it's English. For some comprehension, there are pre-recorded videos. If we have enough time at the end, I can show you some examples of what a recent curriculum uses for these in-class quizzes. You kind of play a video, a DVD for the students, and the students watch that instead of the instructor having to sign the video itself as kind of the reliable source. For production, that's a little different. So, as I mentioned, not all the exams involve production, but not the quizzes. Well, we make a distinction between quizzes and exams, at least in our program. The quizzes don't involve production components, but the exams all do. And so the exams are at least 4 in 506, and a couple in 312L, and it just kind of cascades down from one to the other. Some of them are designed for creation of extended discourse, so a narrative or a dialogue. There are lots of encouragement to create dialogues for ASL instruction, so that the students learn how to engage in actual language use when they're talking to someone else. All the early exams, the ones in 506 and 507, they're recorded in the instructor's offices. So in our department, we'll see, on test day, kind of students spilling out into the hallway, and you can see them all practicing, hurriedly practicing, trying to remember all the signs that they need to remember and the grammar that they need to remember for the test. But the other way you could do it is you could have students go to a language lab, and we use MEZES quite often for our students to, it's MEZES, one of the buildings in the Quinto language lab in our college. And we use these for the students to go and record themselves, producing some sort of response to a prompt, whether it be creating a dialogue, creating and I purposefully say dialogue because sometimes the students have to, by themselves, create something that's a dialogue format. And there's a lot of that in ASL. It's the reporting of kind of a dialogue by shifting your torso. So it's not like you have to have two different people there. You have a single person, and it's almost like, quoting someone else in a different voice, sort of. Right? So dialogues are created, monologues are created, responses are created, all of these types of formats where the student is recording themselves. And then also, if I have enough time and you have any questions about that, I can tell you about the elaborate process we've come up with to make sure that the students do it exactly the way they need to do it. They need to, do it with a certain amount of lighting and create the movie file in a very, specific way and turn it in on a USB drive. And, it's been, I think, a lot of trial and error for these pieces. Everything from students should not be chewing gum when they're being videotaped because that, that's going to occlude some of the other facial features that they might otherwise try to make for grammatical purposes, and so all the details of that, I'm happy to share them if you like. In terms of homework assignments, again, there are kind of both comprehension and production components. The comprehension components, they're either, we have the Signing Naturally curriculum that I mentioned earlier has a 2008 edition for the first, there are 3 levels of this particular curriculum. We're used with 3 different levels of instruction. They don't entirely correspond with, say, 3 semesters, but they're 3 levels. Well, the first level usually does correspond with 2 semesters, and the 2008 edition is that first level. And what's nice about that is it has a lot of homework, and I actually want to get out of this for a second so that I can show you an example of that. Let's see, this. Let me take just a second. This would be the kind of example of a video type of prompt that you would assume would have with the new curriculum, Signing Naturally. And they watch videos and respond in various ways. They can respond either on a sheet of paper. There are questions that are asked sometimes. This, as you can tell, is a dialogue between 2 people, and so there might be questions that concern what did the person in the purple shirt tell the person in the green shirt, or whose house was he going to? As you can see, the signing here is quite slow. This is first semester ASL, probably about the middle of the semester because it's Unit 5, so they haven't gotten maybe middle to late, but they haven't gotten very far. Certainly they know they should know all these lexical items, they should know this basic grammar, but it's purposefully slow signing, right? And so this is a nice example of how the new curriculum, this 2008 curriculum, basically used video. It wasn't in the earlier version, used video so that homework could be assigned that way. It's quite nice. And so these are little dialogues. Here's another one. I skipped ahead here. There's another one with a woman who's talking to someone else about these items that are on the table. And what's nice about it is that you also get the benefit of seeing how these people interact. Meaning, you see what kind of back-channel feedback cues they give, what kind of head nods, how they orient themselves with respect to each other. All those types of behaviors that I think are really important in ASL, you see through these types of homework assignments. So that's a nice way to do it. Let me get back into this. Sometimes you have instructors who do preparation for, you have students at night or during the evenings or homework time, whenever that is, prepare for in-class quizzes or discussions, and that type of preparation involves viewing videotapes. For the production components, As I mentioned, some of this overlaps with the assessment piece that I mentioned earlier. They sometimes create video assignments. We have created step-by-step instructions for the students to create those. For some of the production assignments, they work on particular topics. For instance, they'll do a report on cultural or ethnographic matters related to the deaf community. That's for ASL 507, at least here in this program. For ASL 312L, they'll do a deaf history research report. So there are different ways that they incorporate some of the content that they're learning from the cultural aspects of the course, but also from their own research, either interacting with the community members or what they've learned from online or book reading. And as I mentioned, monologues and dialogues are both produced. And dialogues are sometimes produced with a partner, so it's not always the case that a dialogue is produced just by a single person, but sometimes with a partner as well. So let me shift gears for a moment here and talk a little bit about literary study. Because one of the points that I raised earlier was that you could study ASL literature. And in order for me to say you could study ASL literature, I can tell you what literature might be in ASL. And if you compare ASL as a language that doesn't have a writing system to lots of languages in the world that don't have writing systems, and that have very rich oral narrative traditions, then I think that you can start to understand all the complexity of literature in ASL. It's the challenge is capturing that complexity on, basically documenting it on video. Lots of people refer to these types of oral narrative traditions as language art. There are various aspects of language art: meter, and rhythm, and rhyme, poetic devices, and the same is true for ASL. And Nancy Frischberg, I cited 1988, it's a little bit dated, but I think it's still very valid because it helps us to understand what at least has been conceptualized as ASL literature. It's an old article, but I think it's worthwhile. I've cited her because she talks about these genres of ASL literature, which I'll talk about in just a second here. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that some people don't afford oral literature or oral narrative the same sort of prestige as written forms. But what do I mean by literature, or at least what does Frischberg mean? So she breaks it down into 3 different points: oratory, folklore, and performance art. And I think that students get exposure to all 3 of these through ASL curricula, ASL programs throughout the country. Probably early on, with emphasis on the oratory piece. So they may understand how keynote addresses are delivered in ASL, how someone talks about a topic in ASL. And one of the things that I wanted to show you was, let me see if I'm going to bounce back to the other screen in just a second. But for a second, I want to show you this idea of video blogs. So there are blogs on the internet quite frequently for all sorts of topics. And there are lots of video blogs, or what they call vlogs, in communities where sign languages are used. And I'm sure that there are video blogs using spoken language as well. But the ones that I'll focus on here are for sign language. And so getting back to this idea of these genres of literature, if you consider oratory, how you kind of deliver some sort of presentation or deliver your opinion on a matter, there's a lot of that in vlogs on the internet. I also wanted to give you an example of that. Let's see here. This first one, Joey Bayer is, you can see at the title of this page is called Joey Bayer's ASL Vlog. He's actually a pretty popular character on vlogs. He's got a lot of stuff, a lot of vlogs that he's produced. This one happens to be about the screening of a film that occurred in San Francisco on the topic of autism. Autism, kind of, as a parallel to, or compared to things like racism and sexism. There's a discussion in signing communities of something called autism. So essentially having awarding prestige to people who can use spoken language, but less so to people who use sign language. Right? So there's a prestige associated with spoken language, and really written language for that matter. And then sign languages tend to have less prestige, and so do often the communities. So this piece is just someone explaining that there was a opening night of this particular show, screening of a video, a documentary, and here's a deaf man introducing them. One of the things you can see is that he's signing much faster than the unit that we saw a little while ago within the curriculum. But he's introducing that. This vlog goes on to, I'm just going to forward it quickly, goes on to kind of give some personal accounts of, I think that these are pieces from the actual documentary, and so a student could watch these as ways to understand how you deliver a message in ASL, deliver your opinion on it. Some of them have clear sort of presentational sort of qualities. This man is dressed more formally. He's actually probably using a register that's a little bit more prescribed in ASL. Here's somebody that's, looks like they're in the library. So students are exposed to different types of ASL use. Forwarding on again, here are the writers of that particular documentary, or the creators of the documentary. And so they're what looks like to be in a large auditorium. And how would you sign if you're in a large auditorium? What sorts of differences would you employ? And would you sign larger or slower, or how would you modify your signs? And so these are really nice because they allow a language learner to be able to have access to these different types of styles, of oratory styles in ASL. And there are just I would say hundreds and hundreds of these vlogs out there that have been created by members of the community, and so students are able to see real live ASL. So what we used to do, I think, more often years ago in ASL instruction was to invite deaf visitors to the classroom, or just have students go out into the community. But this is yet another resource that allows them to kind of have access to video technologies. Let me switch back to the presentation. So those are vlogs. But beyond oratory, there's folklore in ASL, there's performance art. Narratives are really an important part of the culture. In fact, good storytellers in ASL are quite highly revered. And so from the point of view of oral narratives and oral, kind of carrying on of the culture, it's a really important piece, I think. Everything from narratives to storytelling to, there are this particular genre of performance art, and I call it performance art, so it's really, Nancy Finchberg looks like lumped it under folklore, but they're called ABC stories, and kids kind of come up with these ABC stories, and it's where the handshake that they're producing corresponds with the handshake that represents a letter of the written alphabet. There's a lot of contact phenomenon in sign languages that come from the ambient spoken languages. They're just kind of a natural part of the evolution of sign languages. They still have their own grammars. They still have their own, lexical items, of course, but there are some contact phenomena, and that's certainly one of them. And it's made its way into the culture in a very significant way. And of course, performance art, right? Poetry and theater and scripted works in ASL, all of which exist. They exist on video, they exist live, and so they're just good ways to kind of carry on the kind of the oral narrative of this culture without the use of writing, right? The challenge is to have these kinds of materials available for students, and now so it's easier than it was years ago, but it still is a challenge if you want very specific things. I think I mentioned everything that was on this page already, with the exception of some of the titles that are listed here. Under narratives, I listed a few of the of the commonly known, or at least heard of a different feather, is very well known narrative in ASL. And I've often shown it to students in the linguistics courses that I teach, because I'm able to show them linguistic features of ASL within this narrative that's very well known. And I think for some people, they may even kind of know it well enough to retell it. It's kind of a long narrative, so you can retell portions of it. But there are narratives that people develop all the time. I mentioned one here, I actually listed one here. One of our instructors, Terry Conley, who's here in the audience, he's one of our lecturers. He created a story called The Bird Story, which is a wonderful story in ASL, and it's been, I've used it again for linguistic analysis and for presentations and discussions of various aspects of ASL. And so they're very much a part of the culture and important pieces for ASL instruction. And then poetry, there are a number of wonderful poets in the deaf community, many of whom have works that are on DVD and on the internet in some form. So students also create their own videos, and they create their own narratives and their own kind of reports. So having the benefit of being able to view these, either through vlogs or what other medium, helps them to understand how they should create their own reports. Now, I want to make sure that I get to, and I have till 2:50, is that about right? We're going to go about 2:50. I want to make sure that I get to this piece about a discussion of what spoken language instruction might be able to take away from this, if you don't already have some of your own ideas. But one of the points that I wanted to kind of emphasize is that ASL, the way we've been instructing our students, is that really there is this focus on developing, the ability to communicate and to use it when you're interacting with members of the deaf community. And this goes back to that earlier point that I made about the deaf community being very invested in the teaching of ASL. I think that they're invested in it in part because it also, these are the people who they're going to interact with in the world who, in some cases, will become sign language interpreters, in other cases will become other professionals. And it's in no way should it be we have to depend on you type of situation, because that's not it at all. It's that these are kind of a bridge between deaf people who sign and the larger hearing community that doesn't sign. So this investment in ASL instruction, I think, is pretty important. But it's really kind of developing what I refer to here as a socio-pragmatic competence. How to use ASL in a way so that you know the right behaviors to use, you know the right way to, basically understand a situation, a context, and then use the right types of skills so that you're understood, so that you can communicate. And so that you're also sensitive to all of the intricacies of deaf culture, well, or at least some of them. It's a very, as you would imagine, very visual culture. So there's a great emphasis placed on how you interact with people to maintain that visual communication. So I just listed a few of these examples of socio-pragmatic competence in ASL or any visual gestural language, right? How to obtain one's attention visually. So just the simple point of how do you kind of break into a conversation, or how do you get someone's attention when they're not looking at you? How does that work? How do you use eye gaze when you're watching a signer? Can you look away or can you not look away? When the signer is signing to you, can they look away or do they have to look at you all the time? We've already talked about dialogues a little bit. How does a signer use their body to depict multiple characters? How do you interrupt someone else? How do you give feedback to someone else when they're signing? All these types of communication devices, this socio-pragmatic competence that I think is really important in visual gestural language, are points that we focus on, I think, a lot in ASL instruction. But very much could be focused on in spoken language instruction, right? And so this leads me to this last slide that I wanted to share with you. And this is where If you have your input, I'd love to hear it too. Certainly, they're inherent in ASL is this visual-gestural modality. You can't remove it from ASL. But one of what it forces us to do is to think about spoken language instruction from the point of view of multimodality phenomena, right? So how do we instruct, various spoken languages, keeping in mind that it's not just the auditory signal that's part of communication, but it's also how you interact with your body and the gestures that you use, and everything from your posture to the actual gestures that are used in the community. There's been a fair amount of work on gesture and adult learning of French, perhaps even some other languages. Doug and I were just talking about German. I don't know of anything in German, but maybe there is something. But it seems to me that it's a way to think about how spoken language instruction can take advantage of communication through multimodal means. There's a lot of work on co-speech gesture, in short, is what I wanted to get that point across. But beyond that, it could be the case, and this is really an empirical question, it could be the case that having a visual model of a spoken language user might actually help someone's pronunciation if they're able to get some cues from the articulators, from the visible articulators, right? Just basically the mouth and the lips and the jaw. But maybe there's some cues that could be gained from that could help with pronunciation or something, some part of spoken language instruction. But again, it's an empirical question that could be examined, and perhaps even used in a L2 classroom. But as we use in ASL, these devices that we use quite a bit, videotaping our students, can videotaping students in spoken language, and maybe it's already done in spoken language classrooms, but if it is, how is it done? I'd love to know how it's done in other classrooms so that we could also learn, so that ASL instruction can learn about that as well. And I think specifically with regard to the content that I discussed earlier about these oral traditions of language use, what are the oral traditions of language use in spoken language communities, and how can they be kind of brought in to the spoken language, the L2 classroom, and used so that students can kind of develop that proficiency as well as the proficiency they get from reading and writing and everything else that they get from the spoken language classroom. So I just gave a few examples of the types of questions that we can ask ourselves for spoken language instruction, but I think that there probably are many more. It's this idea of looking at socio-pragmatic competence and looking at multimodal means for developing that. And maybe spoken language can also learn something from how ASL has, traditionally assessed its students, assigned homework, kind of try to encourage them students to learn literature, and I think that there should just be more interchange between spoken and sign language in terms of the techniques that we use. Thank you.
If there are any questions, raise my to ask.
It's interesting about when you talk about spoken language. I've noticed that deaf parents who have deaf children mostly tend to have good speech skills, or better, oral skills than those who have, and then hearing parents who have deaf children. And I'm not talking about like all of them, but I mean like that language seems to be internalized in a way that with hearing people with spoken language and deaf people with spoken language, they have a different levels of attainment. And I've observed in Texas, I noticed a lot of, I just have found that very interesting. I thought that I'd throw that in there.
So you're saying that there's a connection between, so one thing I didn't mention, I think it's a very important point, is that when I talk about a deaf community, I'm only talking about a bilingual community, right? By default, deaf people are bilingual. Whether or not they use their voice to communicate, they still read and write English to varying degrees. Some of them, very well, others maybe not so well, but they're bilingual. And so there is these interactions between the languages, between English and ASL. And that's true for our deaf community users, But that's also true for our L2 hearing adult users who are learning ASL in the classroom. Right? They already come to the ball game with their spoken language. Most often that's English. And so they're building on that to develop competency in sign language. So there are these ties. We can't, we can't teach our ASL in a vacuum, right? So,
I have a question. When you teach a foreign language, usually we take our social cues from body language, face gestures, hands, eye contact, everything else. But with ASL, can a person who's learning ASL understand the same cues of the person who speaks a different sign language? Can they pick up on the same cues? That's the question.
I think that some of those cues are pretty common across languages and cultures, and I say that some because there probably are some that aren't, right? But there are lots of kind of social interaction type cues that we use, everything from kind of head nods and smiles and whatever, that seem to be very similar across cultures. However, some of those same types of behaviors also exist in sign languages for grammatical purposes, right? So there are head nods in sign language that signal, sometimes prosodic, phenomena, right? The start of a sentence or the end of a sentence, or certain kind of cleft constructions, and just grammatical things, right? So then the challenge there becomes, when is it the social cue versus the grammatical cue? And then that's a little bit more difficult for the students to tease apart. But deaf people in the community know the difference because they become fluent in both the grammar and the social cue and the grammatical cue. Okay.
I'm sorry, we're having a discussion back here. I'm not sure that I understand your point about cues. I'm not sure what cues mean. Like, what's the point of, what is it you're getting at? Like, what is it exactly you're talking about? I don't think we really understand what you're talking about with cues.
So the question was, I think, a really good question about social, these gestures that people use, or various kind of visual ways that we communicate without
Like,
spoken
you mean
language.
like gestures, like comparing gesture and sign language? Is that what you're trying to say?
There are times when I think the gestures that are used for social communication, I think, are also used within the production of a sign language, right? And so then the challenge becomes, and it's not just for the learner of ASL, but it's even for the linguist to try to figure out when is it one versus the other. But yeah, they're both there.
Okay, gotcha.
They're both there.
Okay. Yeah, they're not the same.
I have a question. One of the things I was thinking about is like the ideology of ASL, meaning what do you call this? What do you refer to ASL within the context of your team? She just said foreign language, but then you said they're all bilingual. So do you avoid the term foreign? Do you prefer the term second language, or do you just call this language and not label it at all? Because it's similar, but it's also different. So how do you deal with that? You
and I have talked about this, coming up to this talk too, Carl, about this whole idea of what is the place of the label foreign language with respect to ASL. As I started the talk, one of the very first slides I had was about how the teaching of ASL increased dramatically once it started being accepted as a foreign language, right? As fulfilling the foreign language requirement, right? So for the purposes of ASL instruction and kind of how the vitality of ASL instruction, this designation as a foreign language has been pretty important. Okay? And here at UT, it satisfies the foreign language requirement. It does so at lots of universities. It does so in high schools now. And it's not across the board, but the numbers are pretty high. So for those purposes, foreign language is a really good label. But then, if we're talking about, if I talk about ASL just in terms of kind of linguistic study of ASL, I just call it language, right? It's a language. It's a visual-gestural language. I don't really think of it as a foreign language so much as I think of it as just any one of the world's languages that you can learn or work on, right? But I do see that part of the issue lies in just how, say, government entities define foreign language or not, It's similar to a discussion that exists in the deaf community about the term disability. For governmental purposes, people who cannot hear or cannot hear spoken language fall under this large umbrella of a disability community, right? And so they have access to services like interpreters standing beside me here, and who pays for those services, that's another matter, but they're services that deaf people are entitled to. There are plenty of people in the deaf community who don't like the term disabled. They don't feel like they're disabled at all, that they feel like they can do anything that a hearing person can do, minus the hearing part, right? And so it's like that discussion, and I only bring that in because there are some things that the deaf community is able to benefit from having that label, but there are some things that label really, it's kind of icky in other ways. And I think that the foreign language label is like that, is that ASL is not a foreign language. ASL is a language that's indigenous to the U.S.
That was really my point too.
Yeah.
I was noticing, watching the videos, these are Americans.
Right.
And they dress like me, they look like me,
absolutely.
they're using a different code, but they're Americans.
Right. ASL is a language indigenous to the U.S., right?
Yeah.
But, I grew up in New Mexico, right? And my family's been in New Mexico since 1800. I could say Spanish is a language that's indigenous to the U.S., right? Because we were there before it was a state. So it's that same kind of argument. You can go in circles, but I think for the purposes of,
Well, that's why I said it was an ideology. So how, and I wanted to know how you guys are playing it, because
well, I mean, clearly
we sell French in the French department by not talking about it in North American varieties, by making it kind of this thing that people want. So the more we other it, the more value.
Parisian French, right? And so I think that that ASL, the label foreign language has done a lot for ASL as I think even beyond language instruction, because I think some people who have gone through the ranks of the language instruction and the courses have gone on to become, not just teachers of the language, but also linguists and done other things that have to do, their start was really through the language instruction. That was actually my start, right? I became an ASL linguist because a friend of mine told me, hey, why don't you take this ASL class with me? And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. And so I took my first ASL class when I was 19 years old. And so I think that and it was accepted as a foreign language, foreign language requirement and all those sorts of things. So I think that there's a lot that comes along with it.
Another college, instead of labeling it foreign language, they might label it modern language or something instead of foreign language. So also the word foreign itself, Webster's dictionary says it means, foreign means that does it mean that it's another country? Is that what foreign means in the dictionary? To me, foreign is something that's different. So I don't think it's foreign like a different country. I just think it's foreign like a different language.
So I guess it depends on whose perspective you're trying to describe this from, too. But that's a good point about modern language or second language is also interesting.
Why are the numbers so greater in Texas? Why are...
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. Maybe our ASL instructors might have an idea why. Well, yeah, sure.
Texas is big. That's
But so is California, and so is, let me just go back to
New York.
And so is
I
New York.
think because of the deaf school here in Texas is really popular, and California has a lot of deaf school population as well, large deaf communities in Austin.
Well, that's true, but for instance, California has 2 schools for the deaf, right? And fewer ASL classes in the entire state. Florida has a very large school for the deaf, and they've got a pretty sizable, number of students, right? So those numbers are interesting for Texas. Yeah.
My gut says, my intuition, my feeling is that the large number is because in Texas, we're really lucky. The government has made the decision that ASL is a foreign language. They've made it known to all the people in Texas so that we offer that class. And so enrollment has gone up. Maybe other states have not announced it to everyone. They've kind of kept it hidden so they don't know that they can enroll. And also, I don't know if you're aware, Texas is the first state to require a teacher in public school, any teacher in public school, to be teacher certified to teach ASL in public school. Texas is the first state to require that.
So there could be a
Such a
multitude of
progressive
reasons.
state.
Yeah. You never knew, Carl. So you go out thinking that it's a progressive state.